If you're just joining us, we are in the book of Judges in a series I've titled Unlikely Heroes. Can someone say Unlikely Heroes? Last week we looked at the first of the judges, Othniel. Now these are not judges like courtroom judges behind a desk with a mallet. These are leaders of God's people, deliverers and military leaders. They're commanders and generals, and this is a period of Israel's history that's very unusual and very different from what we're walking through today. Does anybody have famous relative? Anybody a direct descendant of someone famous? Raise your hand. Direct descendant of someone famous. All right, now shout out who that person is. Be bold. Jesse James. That's my namesake. I'm Jesse James Jarvis. I was named after a original portrait of Jesse James that hung in my grandfather's study. So yeah, Jesse James, we got direct descendant. Who else? I saw somebody else raise your hand. James Taylor. All right, there we go. Everybody knows a little James Taylor. Who else? I saw one more. Still with the John Sutter? I'm just kidding. Gold, settler. That was first service. I'm just teasing Mandra. Yes, Candy. Martin Luther. Well, we're going way back. My wife is a direct descendant of Nathaniel Green. If you read 1776 by David McCullough, David Green, was one of the generals with Washington, and he actually was injured in his foot. He hobbled, and he wasn't able to be an officer, and so he enlisted, and very quickly, because of his military knowledge and prowess, he became general and very famous, and she's a seventh direct generation. And so all of us have somebody famous, probably, or somebody we can reach back to. But I want you guys to recognize that in the Scriptures, as we study the Old Testament, we're studying our spiritual ancestry. These are the peoples whose lives led us to where we are. What we are doing as disciples of Jesus in the 21st century in America is happening because of what happened to these people and the way that God intervened on their behalf. And so I'd love for us to, as we reach back into the Old Testament, have it be a little bit more personal, to know who is this person that we're reading about, and who are these people groups that they're invading, and why did this happen, and not just be a boring history lesson to go, these are the people, these are my people, and reach back and hold on to that and hang on to that. And that's the way that I read it, and hopefully you will as well. If not, at least it's going to be very disgusting and entertaining. You ready for that? All right, let's read Judges chapter 3 together and try to hold on to your breakfast. Here we go. Judges chapter 3, starting in verse 12. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So there's the cycle. God's people cry out to him, he delivers them, and then after the judge dies, the people do evil. That's the cycle. The Lord strengthened Eglon, their enemy, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms, formerly known as Jericho. You may have heard of it. Verse 14 says, and the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. Now, just so you know, the Moabites and the Ammonites are the descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot, who left and went into search of the promised land with him in faith. Lot ended up having sons by his own daughters. So we have some incest happening in the Bible. You can read all about it. And these two sons, Moab and Ammon, became the fathers of these people groups, the Moabites and the Ammonites. The Amalekites are the descendants of Esau, the firstborn of Isaac, who had the birthright to become what Jacob and who is Israel became. And so these are actually relatives, cousins of the Israelites. Verse 15 it says, this is the key verse for this morning, then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Everybody say Ehud. It's actually pronounced Ehud, but that sounds like an online ghetto, so I can't say Ehud. Welcome to my Ehud. I don't know, it sounds weird to me. So Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjaminite, a left-handed man. How many are left-handed this morning? Raise your right hand. Oh, gotcha. All the lefties, always with the left. So we got some lefties. Who else? Come on, let me see. Left hand. You can raise your left hand. I was just teasing you. Good. We got a good amount of left-handers. So left-handers represent about 7 to 10% of the population. That's the estimate. And so you're in the minority, and I plan to offend you this morning from the Scripture. But I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a much higher percentage of geniuses that are left-handed than those who are right-handed. So you can take that little tidbit with you if you'd like to stop. Clint says he's one of them. All right. So Ehud is a left-handed man, and that's going to be critical in this story. Verse 15 continues, the people of Israel sent tribute by him, Ehud, to Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, which is the distance from your elbow to the tip of your fingers. Some people's cubit is longer than others. He bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. That's where coming left-handed comes in. In verse 17 it says, and he presented the tribute, which is really extortion, by the king of Moab to Israel. So they're having to bring stuff to Moab because he's the oppressive king and Ehud is the deliverer of the tribute. It says he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon, here's a helpful detail for you, was a very fat man. Thank you for that. And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. So he has a little entourage of people carrying all the goods, the money and the fruit and the produce and so on. Verse 19. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he, the king, commanded, silence. And all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat. And Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and the dung came out. You're like, what are we reading? What is going on in the story? Did you know this was in your Bible? And all this stuff matters. We're going to see. Verse 23. Then Ehud went out into the porch and closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. When he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, surely he is relieving himself. I love the King James here. It says, surely he covereth his feet, which is a great analogy for number 2, because we all cover our feet, if you think about it. Surely he covereth his feet. That is awesome. And they waited until they were embarrassed, like all of us are right now. But when he still did not open the doors to the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there lay their Lord dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Sirah. Verse 27, when he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. So they went down after him, seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. What a crazy story. What in the world is this supposed to teach us today? Isn't that a great question? If Ehud is one of our spiritual ancestors and what he did is recorded for us in the book of Judges, how is this supposed to impact our day tomorrow? None of us, hopefully, are crafting daggers and plan to plunge them into the belly of world leaders. None of us are planning intrigue and espionage and covert ops. Certainly none of us are in a war or being oppressed by an idolatrous nation. So what in the world are we supposed to take from this passage? First off, I just want to remind you, the book of Judges is not primarily about judges. It's not primarily about the people of God. The book of Judges is the story about how God got done what he promised, despite the fact that people always are faithless in response to God's call and promises. Do you know that? The cycle goes down and down. In fact, the whole book of Judges finds itself swirling down the toilet, which never seemed like a more appropriate analogy until this morning's text. It gets worse and worse, not better and better. If you thought that was bad, wait till we get into the later chapters. Those chapters I don't even plan to read in church because of the grisly details and the horrible things that happen there. What we see is that the Lord is the central character. He is the one who has a call on the people of Israel's lives that they reject, that is to purge the Canaanites from the land, to take it over and to represent as God's people a right relationship with God for the world. You know, the land of Israel is actually in the most critical place of the ancient Near East. It is a land bridge between Europe in Asia and all of the African continent. It is the place where everyone passes through. It is the ideal location for God to get the good news of his namesake to the whole known world at the time. This is a strategic place, and God had a strategic plan. Now, if you're like me, I have a hard time with the fact that the book of Judges is about failure to complete ethnic cleansing and the annihilation of entire generations and people groups. Not something that people in our day and age are super excited about. So we get turned into our Bibles, and oftentimes that becomes an objection that I run into as I talk to skeptics or people that disregard Judaism and Christianity, and they go, this is terrible. This is awful. It sounds like God is saying all these people should be dead, and he wants to give this land to these people who didn't live there, and that's in our own American history, what happened with Native Americans and how they were treated and so on. All of this seems to be quite against what's popular and thought to be civil, charitable, and righteous in our own day and age. Anybody ever experienced that objection? I just want to point out two things to you before we move on. One is that we get a glimpse from God's angle, and he is 100% just 100% of the time. He is the God who is righteous and good and loving and kind and patient and never does anything evil or wrong. And we get a sneak peek into his perspective on this ethnic cleansing, as it were, in Genesis 15 and 16. You know that God made a covenant with Abraham, and he promised childless Abraham that he would have a descendant, he would have a child that would fill the world and have more descendants than the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, and they would inhabit a land that God would give to them. And he takes Abraham to the land, shows him the land, makes a promise to give him the land, and then he says, but you don't get to go in. And in fact, none of your descendants do until the fourth generation. Why is that? He tells us in verse 16 of Genesis 15, they shall come back here in the fourth generation. Why? Because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. He said, there's people here that are doing terrible things, but the judgment against them is not full, and it would be wrong in God's perspective to purge them from the land at this point. And so, Abraham, you're going to wait, your kids are going to wait, their kids are going to wait, and then their kids are going to go in, because that will be the point when the judgment of God will rightly fall on this people. That is a perspective that we do not have, cannot have, are not allowed to have, and should not try to project into other parts of the world in our present day, but we are given that glimpse in Genesis 15. 16. There's another clue in the intro, which I told you we'd be reaching back to, and that is in chapter 1, verses 4 to 6. There's this detail that's given to us that's nearly as grisly. Here's what it says. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. And they found the king of Bezek, Adonai-Bezek, at Bezek, and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Listen to this. Adonai-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Well, that's just mean. Why would they do that? Listen to what he says. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him back to Jerusalem, and he died there. We get a glimpse into even the perspective of these Amorite kings, that they had done great evil and that this was the just compensance from God. Now, the reason God wanted to purge these people was not because he hates those people and wants to judge them. In fact, he loves all people and wants to save them. The problem is that he had given this promise and this reality to the people of Israel, and he wanted no infiltration, not genetically primarily, but idolatry. In verses 5 of chapter 3, we see that the people of Israel, instead of purging the Canaanites, lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, all the ites. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives. Their own daughters they gave to their sons, intermarrying, intermingling. What was the point of not doing that? Was this, and they served their gods. And therefore, the true knowledge of God will eventually be lost because of this activity. This is why it mattered. It's not about killing people. It's not about purging people groups. It's about the true knowledge of God reaching the world, and that was a threat. But listen, here's the good news, brothers and sisters, and can't we just rejoice in this? Galatians 4:4 tells us that in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons and daughters, God has sent his Spirit of his Son into into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. You know what this means? It means not only did the judges need a king and they had no king, not only did they need a land and they had no land, not only did they need new hearts and they had old hearts, but God acted in time so that we can exist in an age where the Spirit of God is given, new hearts are given to God's people. We are no longer in a battling age where we're fighting people. Our fight is not physical, it is spiritual. God is contending for the souls, the hearts and minds of people. And He has fulfilled all of His promises in Jesus so that we no longer fight over land. We no longer fight with swords, but instead we contend through prayer and love and testimony to who God truly is. And we love people, and that's where our battlefield is. Isn't it great to be born in this era and not that era? Amen, it is. But there's still things we can learn. And so with our remaining time, let's be introduced to this character. Who was Ehud? Verse 15 says, people cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer. Ehud, the son of Gera the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. A couple things about Ehud. He is of the people of Benjamin, who in verse 21 of chapter 1 did not drive out the Jebusites. They are equally to blame for the problem they are in. And he is the son of Gera, which doesn't help. One thing I want to tell you, as a Benjaminite, it's kind of an odd play on words. You know what Benjamin means? Son of my right hand. And so we have Ehud, the Benjaminite, the son of my right hand, who is left-handed. And so there's some irony there. Now, not only is being left-handed put you in the minority, it makes it difficult to use scissors and can openers and zip your zipper, right? It's trouble to sit next to you when we're eating dinner. All the little challenges that we face. I'm married to a left-hander. I've got some left-handers in the family. I know all the woes. That's not actually the problem. You see, there's an idiom in Hebrew for being left-handed. They don't even say left-handed. In fact, the words for left in every language come out to be something pejorative. In English, left comes from a Latin word that ended up meaning sinister. Left-handed, out of left field. Sometimes in French, I think it's gauche, which is like evil or tricky. And so everything left-handed has always been negative. So you could say, okay, he's a left-handed of the right-handed bunch, and so he's kind of odd. But the idiom actually means impeded in his right hand. Now, it's possible that that's just a way that they would say you're left-handed because you can't write with your right hand, and so you're impeded. But more than likely, and there's some clues in the text, that he was born with a withered right hand or a deformed right hand. His name, Ehud, means sympathy or pity, which a lot of times name meanings would have been given in response to the birth of the child. We see that over and over and over in the scriptures. And so it's very possible that he was forced to be left-handed because his right hand was damaged or deformed. This obviously gives him access to become the one delivering the tribute because he is not a threat to anyone in the palace. We see that he is given open access to the king, even private access to the king, and he's able to sneak in his concealed weapon, and no one pats him down, likely because of this deformity. And you may not get that from reading the text the way that we read it through. Now, why does that matter? And what that makes him an unlikely hero, certainly. Why it matters to us is because every single one of us has some sort of deformity, some sort of disability. There's something about us that holds us back or that we perceive as a weakness. And here's the challenge, brothers and sisters. What happens in our life is that those things that are our weaknesses, those things that we perceive as disabilities or that the world tells us is a disability, those are the things that start to identify us. They are the things that break us down on the inside. They're the things that hold us back from being what God has called us to be. Those are the things that make us feel little and paralyze us from moving forward into the things that God calls us to. Maybe it's not a physical deformity. Maybe you are not comfortable speaking to people and you're difficult relationally. Maybe you're a super introvert, a hermit. And so to be told that you're to give testimony to God and to relate to people and to be a part of a church and to share your life, you go, oh, I don't want to do that. Maybe you're overcommitted at work and you are busy. That's what you are. What are you? I am busy. I am too busy. Maybe you're too short or too tall or too big or too slow or whatever you think you're too. Those are the things that get into our head and start to make us and break us. Ehud was no exception. I wonder what it is for you. I'm sure in middle school you got railed for it. Maybe as an adult. Kids are always happy to tell you what it is. My wife, I mentioned she's left-handed. She also has the most amazing set of perfect dimples that any human being's ever had. I love them. I remember when we were first married, there was a little boy in our church, and he looked at her one day, just staring at her, and he goes, "Why do you have holes in your cheeks?" Right? I've had kids look at me and go, your ears stick out. I'm like, all the better to hear you with, my dear. Like, what are you supposed to say to that? Like, well, your nose is big, like, I don't know, like, no, we don't act like that, but it's those things about us that start to shape us and how we feel about ourselves. The thing we think as a weakness, when God sees, he sees a hidden strength. You know why? Because it's always been the plan of God to exalt himself by moving in the weakness of people. This has always been the story all through the scriptures. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul recounts a physical ailment he had. Some thought it was severe blindness. He had been beaten close to death so many times. Maybe he couldn't see. Maybe he had to be delivered around. They don't know. Maybe he had some internal problem, some pain. But he pleads with God 3 times to take it away. And God says no. And instead of saying yes, he says in verse 9, God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul says his response, therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. Why? For when I am weak, then I am strong. That's the Christian life. That's who our Jesus has been. Do you know that? He gave himself in weakness. He didn't live mighty. He wasn't a king with a sword. He didn't come in battle. He offered himself up in self-sacrifice. He gave himself away. And it's in our weakness that the strength of God is seen. It's made perfect. And there's never a question about who gets the credit. That's what happens in the story. I love this story. That's the source of Ehud's success. We see that he works with God, though. I love the fact that it says he fashioned a dagger. I'm like, what did he make that thing out of? The Moabites would have taken all the weapons out of Israel. What did he make it out? Was it a wood dagger? Was it a metal dagger? But he fashioned it. He made it. How many times was he carrying tribute to King Eglon? How many times did he strap that thing to his inner thigh and sneak through security with his concealed weapons permit? Right? What was that like every single time? Heart racing, wondering if he's going to be found out and executed on the spot over and over and over, bringing the tribute. How many times did he grow up thinking about this oppressive king? It's obvious he was a young man. He ends up having peace for 80 years. And so he probably remembers when Othniel was judge and there was peace in the land. And he probably watched Moab and the Ammonites and the Amalekites conquer his people. He grew up right around the city of Palms. That's where Benjamin lived. And so he got to be abused and oppressed and ridiculed and insulted. His life was one of hardships, and he has a withered right hand, and his job is to bring presents to the conquering king. You can imagine the rage in his heart again and again and again being forced into this situation. Can you imagine coming face to face with the man responsible for your oppression? Talk about being in a terrible situation. So he takes a risk, puts himself out there. Now, it's obvious in this passage that God's the one who orchestrates this, although his name is not mentioned in the actions. It's all about Ehud. But look what happens. This is kind of funny. Ehud goes in with the concealed weapon. He goes through the tribute, gives it to him. They leave. And I wonder if he chickened out. Because it says they reached the idols at Gilgal. Gilgal was the place where Joshua had the 12 tribes place stones to commemorate crossing the Jordan. This was supposed to be a holy place, a holy site commemorating the power of God. And the Moabites have turned it into a place of idols. And he gets back there, and I think he was just, I got to go back. And he goes back in, and he says to the king, I have a secret for you. And the king wants the secret, doesn't want anybody to know the secret. Everybody out! He says, I have a secret from God for you. And then he does, say hello to my little friend, right? Jabs that knife up inside of him. Can you imagine that moment? This grisly moment? It says that the handle went in after the blade. I don't know if you guys watch these crime documentaries. I really enjoy crime documentaries. One of the things that happens when they're examining someone that's been stabbed is that someone who is stabbing someone for the first time, they don't know how to stab. They've never stabbed. And so a lot of times there's a very shallow stab wound followed by another one, followed by another one. This is what happens. It's probably more than you wanted to know, right? Right? So Ehud pushes that sword so deep in this man that he loses it. I can guarantee you Ehud was not planning on leaving his sword there. Okay, so this was not what he saw coming. His first ever thrust, and he about pushes the whole thing through this guy. You see the rage. You see, he's not willing for things to continue the way that they were going. He's passionate about God's people and about the rest that God intended. Then he goes back, and having successfully defeated this king, he calls all the people, follow me. And can you imagine that? The Lord has given our enemies into our hand. And yet God used him, and his power was made visible in Ehud's weakness. All of these judges fall short in some way. I don't know if you noticed the way Ehud's fallen short. I'll give you a clue. It has to do with deception and murder. I don't know if you noticed. This is a sneaky little dude. This is a covert operation that's happening here. He takes matters into his own hands. Nothing about this is okay. Do you know that? He's lying, he's sneaking, he's murdering, he's plotting. This is murder one, folks. This is not drawing battle lines. It's not having faith in God to go, all right, everybody, we're going out there, we're standing up against the king. No, he goes for the jugular. Actually, not the jugular. But there's also this clue that God's the one who allows him to escape. You can't see it in the English, and I think it's actually purposely covered up because it's really gross. So you notice the fact that the sword goes in, he can't get the sword out, and it says the dung comes out, which is really gross. I hate to describe this to you. I always kind of imagine, because I read the New King James Version when I was a kid, it says the entrails came out, so I imagine this kind of slashing and, whoa, okay, all right, too much. But more than likely what happens is that thrust goes directly through his aorta, and Ehud would have bled to death in about 5 seconds. And when that happened, the number 2 he was holding stopped holding, and that's where the dung comes out. Now this is helpful because this is the thing that allows Ehud to escape. Do you know this? God allows this. No, Ehud was not planning on this happening, and yet the guards smell this smell, and the doors are locked, so they're, okay, just waiting for you to be done in there. But it says Ehud locks the doors. Now, where in the world, how do you get out when you lock the doors? Well, I don't know if you know this, but in cool chambers would have been a second floor indoor bathroom. There was no indoor plumbing, and so there would just be a hole that second floor down, the servants would be clearing out. And the Hebrew is that he went through the porch. And so Ehud loses his sword, and the good news is that God always provides a way out, right? It may not be the way you want to go, but there's always a way. He went full Shawshank Redemption in this moment to escape. And God's active. You see that in the text. Ehud moves. He does the thing that he feels like he's supposed to do. He does it imperfectly. He does it with some contriving, and God provides a way out. This is amazing stuff. Now, it gets better. And this is where I'll conclude. You got to love this juxtaposition between Eglon, which means strong bull. Do you know that? That's what Eglon means. Strong like bull. And then it says he was a very fat man, which is a Hebrew phrase that means he was all fattened up. This is the phrase they would use of a calf that was about to be slaughtered for a feast. This is God's perspective. He says, you use a power and violence to overtake. You're strong. And what I see is something that's ripe for celebration, for slaughter. You see something that is weak and useless. I see an opportunity for deliverance and for power. And God's perspective is oftentimes completely backwards from ours. Eglon is a picture of excess. He's benefiting off of the oppression of other people. Here is Ehud giving away as tribute the things that his people have worked hard for. He is a picture of sacrifice and offering. And in this portrait, we see what matters more than anything else. Here, this sympathetic Ehud, son of my right hand, who's left-handed, bound or limited in his right hand, defeats the strong bull, fattened calf. Now here's the amazing thing, brothers and sisters. We're not called to engage in physical warfare. None of us are going to go out and battle for Christ. There's no more crusades. There's no more land grabs. Every single human being on the planet is precious to God. And what he was seeking to preserve in Judges chapter 3 is the truth of who God really is. And that truth has been made plain and clear in the person of Jesus. And that's the news that we're meant to take out. In fact, all of us have a double-edged sword. Hebrews chapter 4 says the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. It pierces to the division of soul and spirit, joints and marrow, and discerns the thoughts and intentions of the heart. No creature is hidden from from its sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Brothers, when you go out, sisters, when you go out into the world with the love of God motivating you, empowering you, speaking reality and truth, setting people free from the oppression of the lies of the enemy, you have a sharp sword that gets into hearts and souls. It doesn't kill the body, but it brings life to the spirit. This is who God has called us to be. And whatever you think is holding you back, whatever that thing is that you've made to identify yourself, your label, disabled, addict, too busy, too late, too slow, God says, absolutely not. Give me what you have and I'll work power for you. I love in Revelation chapter 1, last scripture, Jesus, the risen Jesus, reveals himself to John the prophet in a vision, and his face is seen as shining like the sun. He's standing in the presence of the lampstands, which is a symbol of God's people. He's here, he's present, and coming from his mouth is a double-edged sword. See, we have a king who is alive and well and doing work in the hearts of men and women. He's doing it perfectly, and he's doing it as we give ourselves in whatever weakness we have to him. He will work through us. His words will reach the ears and the hearts of those who need it. And he just wants us to stop being limited by the things that we identify ourselves as. Amen.